Hi guys, it's Ankita. Welcome to another video. If you're new here, welcome to my channel. I talk about books here, so if you haven't already subscribed, please subscribe to my channel so that you can follow along on my reading journey. In this video, I'm going to talk about a book that took me 2 months, almost 2 months to complete, and it in no way reflects upon the book itself, but it's just that ever since I've read Middlemarch, I just haven't been able to get into a book. What I am trying to say is that I have been in a major reading slump, and it's so frustrating. Anyway, this is a book about escaping from reality, going to Italy, to a villa, staying there for 4 weeks and finding oneself. In this book, we follow 4 characters. It all starts with Mrs. Wilkins, who feels imprisoned in her marriage. Her husband is very tight-fisted. He seems to be a very popular man in the society, but she is not very outgoing. But Mrs. Wilkins has been a really good wife, and she is just tired of being good because she is just not happy. And she feels in order for her to be happy, she needs to remove herself from her current situation. So this one fine day, she comes across an advertisement, and it is about a villa which is on rent for 4 months in Italy. So she is super excited, but it is very expensive, and if she were to rent it herself, then she would have to basically spend her entire savings, and her husband is very tight-fisted, so she doesn't feel really comfortable asking him to pay for her vacation where she wants to go on her own. So she approaches Mrs. Arbuthnot, who she kind of recognizes from her church, but she has never spoken to her. But she still approaches Mrs. Arbuthnot and asks her whether she would like to join her, in renting that villa in Italy. Now, Mrs. Arbuthnot is a very religious woman. She's kind of reluctant to rent a fancy villa because she is usually quite charitable and she works for the poor in the society, so she doesn't really feel comfortable spending on a luxurious vacation. However, she finds Mrs. Wilkins very odd, and she thinks that, okay, Mrs. Wilkins definitely needs this vacation. So in order to help Mrs. Wilkins, Mrs. Arbuthnot agrees to go with her to this Italian villa. What is interesting is that Mrs. Arbuthnot herself is married to a very famous author, but she is not proud of him because her husband writes historical books about mistresses, king's mistresses, and she finds it very distasteful and immoral. And she and her husband have grown apart. That was something that I found was very interesting about Mrs. Arbuthnot because it played into the plot of the story. So these 2 women get together and they decide to go to Italy, but they still find that the rent is too high, and so they take on board 2 other women, one of whom is Lady Caroline, who is a spinster, a very good-looking spinster, socially active, and who is just sick of socializing and of being complimented all the time. So she wants to kind of escape all the parties and social gatherings and just go away to this villa. And then the 4th woman is an elderly woman, Mrs. Fisher, who I found to be very strange. She once upon a time was friends with famous poets, and obviously she has quite different views to these young women. Anyway, these 4 ladies go on their own to this Italian villa, and that's where the story actually starts getting interesting. It reminded me of my college days when I used to share an apartment with other girls, and it was not easy because each of us were obviously very different. And that's what we find in this book, is that everyone is so different and everyone is there for a different reason, but essentially they are all escaping from the the reality. I will say that I liked the first half of the book, but the second half of the book started getting very repetitive, and I found the narration quite tiresome because it felt to me like the author was explaining each and every action, and I sometimes find it more interesting when the authors leave a few things, a few actions of the protagonists kind of open to interpretation, especially after they have introduced the character to us. So to a certain extent, I did find it repetitive, and that's where it started getting a bit slower for me. What I did like about this book is the description of the villa itself and the number of flowers that were blooming, and just the Italian landscape was so stunning. It made me want to escape to Italy, to a beautiful, beautiful villa. Another thing that I found interesting in this book was the marriages of Mrs. Wilkins and Mrs. Arbuthnot. So Elizabeth Von Arnim herself was married quite a few times, and I have a feeling that she drew upon her own experiences, because the way that Mrs. Wilkins and Mrs. Arbuthnot feel about their partners is something that, every person who is being married might have felt at some point. I also really like the character of Mrs. Wilkins. She's a very lovable character. She's a very likable character, so loving and very optimistic. And we find that her stay at this Italian villa totally transforms her perspective. It is truly a delightful read. There was enough humor at the beginning of the book. I found the characters quite interesting, but the middle was a little bit of a drag, like I said. Even though it's a very small book, I really did struggle to pick it up and read because I was just so tired of constant explanations of the actions, and that is something that I think could have been easily left out, and it could have been actually a novella, like a 150-page book, or perhaps only 100 pages. I ended up giving this book 3 stars. I probably never ever read this book again, or maybe I will. Maybe when I am really old, I might read this book, but definitely not for the next 30 years. I really love the description of the villa itself and the gardens surrounding the villa, so I'll read out a little bit. All down the stone steps on either side were periwinkles in full flower, and she could now see what it was that had got at her the night before and brushed wet and scented across her face. It was wisteria and sunshine. She remembered the advertisement. Here indeed were both in profusion. The wisteria was tumbling over itself in its excess of life, its prodigality of flowering, and where the pergola ended, the sun blazed on scarlet geraniums, bushes of them, and nasturtiums in great heaps, and marigolds so brilliant that they seemed to be burning, and red and pink snapdragons, all outdoing each other in bright, fierce color. The ground behind these flaming things dropped away in terraces to the sea, each terrace a little orchard, where among the olives grew wines on trellises, and fig trees and peach trees and cherry trees. The cherry trees and peach trees were in blossom, lovely showers of white and deep rose color among the trembling delicacies of the olives. The fig leaves were just big enough to smell of figs. The wine buds were only beginning to show, and beneath these trees were groups of blue and purple irises, and bushes of lavender, and gray, sharp cactuses, and the grass was thick with dandelions and daisies, and right down at the bottom was the sea. Color seemed flung down anyhow, anywhere, every sort of color, piled up in heaps, pouring along in rivers. The periwinkles looked exactly as if they were being poured down each side of the steps, and flowers that grew only in borders in England, proud flowers keeping themselves to themselves over there, such as the great blue irises and the lavender, for being jostled by small, shining, common things like dandelions and daisies and the white bells of the wild onion, and only seemed the better and more exuberant for it. There are so many descriptions of the like, and that's something that I truly savored in this book. Even though it is obviously a really good spring read because of the description, because it takes place in April, in the month of April, and when the flowers are blooming and the earth is smiling. But I think this will also make a good summer read, especially if you are going away for a holiday in Italy or the Mediterranean. Alright, so those were my thoughts of this lovely book, The Enchanted April by Elizabeth Von Arnim. If you have already read this book, please let me know in the comments down below what your thoughts are, and thank you so much for watching this video. If you haven't already subscribed, please subscribe to my channel and hit the like button, and I will see you next time. Until then, take care.